may help for you to know that Frances Moore Lappé has been identified by many people across the country. And speaking of across the country, she has just flown in this morning from St. Louis. And tomorrow she leaves for London. So she has made this stop very specially to come back to Worcester State College and to share her ideas and her hope with you. In introducing her, I'm just going to briefly quote the great historian Howard Zinn. He wrote, "A small number of people in every generation are forerunners in thought, action, and spirit, who swerve past the barriers of green and power to hold a torch high for the rest of us. Lappé is one of those." The Washington Post said, "Some of the 20th century's most vibrant activist thinkers have been American women. Margaret Mead, Janet Rankin, Barbara Ward, Dorothy Day, who took it upon themselves to pump life into basic truths. Frances Moore Lappé is among them, and we are delighted that she has come to share with us." Frankie, welcome.
I'd like to just begin with where I began when I was 26 years old. I found, as many of you are finding, that food could be the greatest unraveler of mysteries of how do we get into this mess that nobody wants us to be in, I think, where people are going hungry in the midst of plenty. But I found that my intuition as a 26-year-old was that food, because it is so personal and yet universal, because it ties us directly every day to the earth and to one another as we break bread together, and of course to our own bodies and its health. I mean, if I could just figure out why hunger. And so I started on this quest, not knowing anything about food, agriculture, economics. I sat in the library asking, are the experts right? Are we really running out of food? Is that why people are going hungry? Because that's what all the newspaper headlines and the experts were telling us. And then in my own sort of following my nose research, I learned that in fact, as we all know now, that there is more than enough food in the world to make us all chubby, much less survive, right? So I then began to see hunger as a symptom, and people often say, oh yes, hunger is a symptom of poverty. And I then peel away the next layer and say, yes, but what is poverty a symptom of? And I think this is the theme that has carried me through all of these almost 4 decades, is just continuing to ask the next question. So the additional C in my subtitle should have been curiosity, because curiosity, as one historian put it, is the greatest antidote to fear. So if you just keep that curiosity alive. And so I said, wait a minute, what is poverty a symptom of? And gradually came to put it this way, and I want to come back to this at the end of my talk, but I began to see that poverty itself is a symptom of people's powerlessness, is how I put it. But then I moved in a slightly different framing, in that poverty and the hunger that follows from that is a symptom of human relationships that are out of balance, extremely out of balance. And that as long as we simply focus on things, you know, when I was in my 20s, it was food aid was the thing. You know, we just ship them our food and we'll end their hunger. As long as we focus on things, even if it be dollars, or even if it be seeds or plows or whatever, I became convinced that as long as we focus on things and turn our eyes from the quality of human relationships and how we create and share power together, that we will never really get to the root of hunger, because that's really what it's about. It's about our relationships with one another in our communities. So that's sort of the biggest kind of, I got down there, but then I started asking, okay, but how do I make sense of this? That I'm living in this world where I'm certain that I couldn't go out in Worcester, I couldn't go out where I was in St. Louis or where I'm going to London, I couldn't find anybody anywhere who would say, yeah, I think it's a great thing that maybe 15,000 children will die today of hunger in the world. I want to do my part to make sure that children go hungry. No, we're not going to find anyone who would say that. So how do we make sense of the fact that moment to moment we are creating this world in which that is happening, totally needlessly? What is it, 1 million children now are dying of malaria? Totally, completely preventable. And of course, hunger is a big part of why they're dying, because they're weakened by hunger. So that just seized my curiosity. How is it that we are creating as societies, now going global, that which as individuals we abhor, because not one person says they want hunger? So, how do we make sense of it? And gradually, over the decades, what I come to, and there's more and more neuroscience on this. In fact, I just picked up in the airport yet a new Scientific American proving with an MIT scientist how this works in our brains. But the big thing that I want, the big point, I actually didn't get from a neuroscientist. I got from a social philosopher named Erich Fromm. And some of you of my generation, I'll point to my gray hair, my generation will recognize that name because he was quite well read in the 1970s. But he wrote a book, Erich Fromm wrote a book called The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness. And in this book he writes one sentence that is really a mind bender. He says, it is man's, excuse the sexist language, but this was the 70s, this was the 80s. It's man's humanity that makes him so inhuman. And what he then goes on to explain, and this is, I have to give him a lot of credit because a lot of this science that proves him right came later. But what he says is that human beings, our distinct thing about humans is that we carry within us these frames through which we see, and we don't see what is not inside our frame. Our experience is filtered through what my daughter and I, in Hope Sedge, which Maureen kindly mentioned, we call the mental map. And we breathe that mental map in sort of unconsciously. It's the mental map of our culture. And it really filters our thinking processes. And my thesis that I'm putting out this afternoon here is that we absorb a mental map, what he called frame of orientation, that is fundamentally life-destroying. And here we are in this room together, on this planet together, beginning of the 21st century, where we have to shed this life-destroying map. And I believe, and what gets me up in the morning, and what really excites me when I hear about what you're doing, is I think through direct experience, we can shed the disempowering mental map and discover that we don't have to accept this world that violates our deepest sensibilities and our common sense. That human beings are capable, now that I think the planet is really on the ropes with global heating and global poverty, the planet is on the ropes. People are saying, okay, let's get serious. And that's what I mean by getting a grip in the title of my book. Getting a grip means willing to go to root causes. And a root cause, I'm saying, is the very thought system that we absorb. So how does it relate to hunger? Well, I'm going to boil this way down.
Yeah.
But in my book, I start out, you open the flap of my book, and there's a spiral. It's called the spiral of powerlessness, that I say is the thought that takes us down, away from our own true intelligence and sensibilities. And it starts with the premise, the false premise of lack. There is not enough. We hear that all sorts of ways. Advertising, there's not enough. There's not enough food, there's not enough land, there's not enough parking places in Boston, there's not enough love, there's not enough jobs, there's not enough housing we can afford, there's not enough. Okay, there's not enough goods, and on top of that, we absorb the idea, the belief that there's not enough goodness in human beings. So not enough goods and not enough goodness. Because what we absorb through advertising and all sorts of messaging is that human beings, when you really strip away the fluffy stuff, what we can really count on is that we are competitive, selfish, and materialistic. And that's all we can really count on, so we build from there. Now, that premise, basically if we set that, I'm saying we're done for. Because what that leads to is this feeling of powerlessness and distrust fundamental distrust of our neighbors. So we believe we have to turn over our fate to some impersonal force, what Ronald Reagan loved to call the magic of the market, right? If people can't afford housing, it's the magic of the market. If people can't afford food, it's the magic of the market. That's the way it is. We can't tamper with it. And we turn over our fate to those we see as having more authority, more power. We think of power as something somebody else has. Then what comes out of that is what I call thin democracy. And actually, I think now it's too charitable a term. Because what we end up with then is the belief, and that I was born into growing up in Texas in the 1950s, that if we have elections and we have a market economy, we've got democracy. Yay. And all we have to do is maybe vote if we want to and shop. You know? And we've got democracy, and we can export it. It's so great. So I'm saying that this belief system of lack, starting with there's not enough. We have to scramble to get our stuff. We can't trust one another. We have to turn over our fate to some infallible force. And of course, it's not just any kind of market. This magic that Ronald Reagan was talking about is, you know, markets, the exchange of goods with each other. That's been around for, you know, eons of time. But somehow, in this society, we came up with the idea that a market could only be driven by one rule, and that it could bring good outcomes for everybody. And that one rule is highest return to existing wealth. People who already have the shares. So, what happens? Wealth concentrates and concentrates and concentrates because it's a one rule that returns wealth to wealth. So we should not be surprised, although actually I was horrified when I just read this in a new book by the former Secretary of Labor, Robert Reich. One family in America, one family controls as much wealth as the bottom 40% of Americans put together. Do you know what family that is? Walton's? Yes. Walmart. Yes. Now, isn't that figure, one family controlling as much wealth as 40% of the people, you know, that is the kind of thing that I associate with Guatemala, or I associate with old Europe with the aristocracy and the royalty. What would our founders think? Here we are. So, but I'm saying it's not because they're bad people. It's not because people are, you know, it's, you know, I think I am not saying that this consequence is a result of a few bad people who plot to grab all of the money. I'm saying it flows inexorably from a belief system. So we have to be able to surface these assumptions that end up creating such concentrated wealth and power, because that concentrated wealth, as we know, then infuses itself and infects and distorts our political decision-making, so that from the Farm Bill to pharmaceutical law governing our drugs or whatever, it's the industries that are benefiting that are right in there actually helping to write the legislation. And this is not some weird conspiracy theory. This is what our Washington now looks like. There are 61 lobbyists in Washington for every person that you and I have voted to represent us there. Citizens are outnumbered 61 to 1. So we have to go that deep. And I'm starting out with the bad news, but we have to go that deep in order to begin to recognize how we got here. And so I'm just going to talk about, for another moment, on the thought system that gets us here. And stick with poverty, because it is at the root of hunger in this country and the world. But again, it reflects these deeper thought systems. So, you know, how often do we hear things like, the poor will always be with us? How often do we hear that, oh yes, you know, we really want to end poverty? In fact, a new survey of people with evangelical faith, they rank poverty as a moral issue 3 to 2 times more often than, say, gay marriage or criminalizing abortion, things like this, which you associate often with that faith. Poverty is but yes, we feel this is a moral issue, but then we say, well, yes, but ending poverty would be so costly, we can't possibly do it. Or people say, yes, ending poverty would be a great thing, but you know, that would require such an intrusive government, you know, the big brother sort of making decisions. We can't go there, because that's not the American way. So I'm saying, again, when we get down even to the nitty-gritty of poverty, there are these big myths, these big ideas that tie our hands and make us feel powerless. So I just want to spend a little time with each of these. First of all, this idea that ending poverty is too costly, because it drives me wild. First of all, a new study came out, and it's really a really good study, and I could get you the citation on it, but I'll just give you the conclusion. It came out in the spring. They estimated conservatively just the actual cost to taxpayers of having children grow up in poverty, and they said the results in terms of healthcare consequences, and we know that most jails are mainly poor people in them, and we're paying, we're paying as much to keep somebody in prison today as to put them through Harvard University. So it is incredibly costly. They estimate that American taxpayers, not to mention the human devastation and the misery and the stunted gifts of people who aren't able to develop their full gifts, just the cost to taxpayers, they estimated at $500 billion a year that shows up in greater healthcare costs and all these other things because we tolerate poverty. So the cost to us is not ending poverty, the cost of poverty itself. And so I think we've got to just shift that frame. And another feature, another myth that drives me wild is that kind of, well, it's related to this idea that, well, if we really wanted to end poverty and hunger, then it would require this intrusive state. And besides that, we really don't know how. That really drives me wild. So I just want to tell you what I thought of recently is the tale of two generations. My growing up and my children's growing up. And this is the only point I wish I had a PowerPoint. I hate PowerPoints, but right now it'd be useful. Just bear with me a little bit and try to visualize these two bar charts. My generation and my children's generation growing up. I was in 1944, and I came to adulthood in let's say in the mid-70s. My children were born in the 1970s, came to adulthood, you know, in their 30s now. So the tale of two generations. Imagine this bar chart that measures, what I'm asking you to visualize is the advancement of the real purchasing power of families in America, in my generation growing up, by each segment of the population, from the poorest fifth to the richest fifth, right? So imagine a chart that is showing you how the real purchasing power of families advanced from the 1940s to the mid-70s. And in that period, what you see is astonishing. Every single income bracket saw real family income increase. And you know who increased the most? The poorest. 116% in real purchasing power on the part of the family. And you know that was mainly with one income earner, which the second period is very different. And every piece of American income groups advanced. The poorest advanced the most, and the richest advanced the least, but they did fine, really fine. Now, that's my generation. Now look at my children's generation. They were born in the 70s. They're in the 30s now. And you look at a similar bar chart. What happens? Oh my goodness, the contrast. In one generation, what happened to the poorest people? Virtually no gain, 2.6%. Middle income, now remember this is with two income earners now, right? Because more and more women are working, so it even exacerbates what I'm saying. If you consider the first, my growing up was with one income earner, now with two or more income earners. Okay, the second period, the poor, 2.6% improvement. The middle, a little bit of gain, 20-30%. And the wealthiest, the top 5%, did extremely well, but interestingly, even they didn't do as well as they did when everybody was gaining. So this notion, please help fight this notion that we don't know how to end poverty. We made huge advances. In the 1960s, I was a community organizer, and one of the things that I was doing was, this common sense thing of helping people in a very, very poor area of Philadelphia. And this was supported by the federal and state government to get income together to have a down payment on a house. Home ownership, hey, we know that's incredibly important. So, that was called the War on Poverty, that had many, many, many dimensions to it. And you know what has been said about the War on Poverty since the 1960s? Oh, yes, we waged a war on poverty, and poverty won. Actually, during the 1960s, the poverty rate was cut in half. So please do not buy the myth about our country that we don't know how. And so what is the difference between my generation growing up and my children's generation growing up? In policy, it's quite clear. It doesn't take a PhD in economics. It doesn't take, a rocket scientist, as the cliche goes. What is the difference? In one case, the minimum wage was such that it actually meant something, and in my children's generation, it lost 25% of its value. In my generation growing up, there was aid for people like veterans to buy homes and to go to school, to go to college for free. That was a huge advancement for poor and middle class people. Unions, the right to unionize was protected, whereas in my generation, now today, thousands of people get fired every year because of attempting to organize a union. And yet we know, on average, unionized workers have a median income 25% above non-unionized. We had progressive income taxes, which means that the poor pay more because they have so much more, and because a lot of that wealth is because of the society that's supporting them. So of course they do pay more. Republican president,
the rich pay more.
the rich pay more, sorry. The rich pay more progressive income taxes because they have more. And what I find so interesting that people have forgotten, Republican tax rate was, during this very successful period in the 50s, it was 90%, the highest tax rate. And now it's way down in the 20s, 30s, something like that. I mean, and this was a highly successful economic period, I say, for every income group, but especially the lowest income group. We were making real advances. So I think this notion that we don't know how to do it is one of those we can just drop. We can just shed that. It's not, it doesn't take a PhD, it takes common sense. And guts, but we'll get to that in a minute. So what I'm suggesting then is, as we shed this notion that democracy is just something done to us or for us, that it's just driven by this one real economy and somebody we elect, and never mind that that person we elect is more accountable to those who donated the big bucks than to us, that's the best we can do. That's the belief system I believe we have to shed. And to follow our curiosity as we create what I love to call living democracy. And I love to call it living democracy because it captures this idea that democracy is not a thing that we inherited that's fixed. It is a journey that we're in together. It's a living organism. And this is what our founders talked about, that every generation is about creating what works for them. So it's this idea of democracy as a living organism. And so in it then, citizens stop being simply these passive victims or people who, can only just buy into what is, but rather they are the fundamental solution finders, actively engaged in their communities, from their schools as you are, onto national policy such as engagement in shaping the Farm Bill, which as Maureen was pointing out to me, for all it's still answering to the largest corporate interest in our country. For the first time it has more, you were saying, more support for food stamps than in the past. So all the way along, it is the engaged citizen that makes democracy work. And it is a rethinking of the role of government. So both the role of citizen needs to be rethought and the goal of government. And what I love to think of the role of government because that's the big stopper for a lot of people in this country, because of the messaging, the drip, 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 government is the demon, it's the enemy, it can never do anything. Well, I like to think of government in these roles in a living democracy. One, it is a convener. I just met someone from the state ag department here. The role of convener, of helping to just bring people together to begin to generate ideas. It is the role of standard setter, what we all have to live up to in various roles. It is the role then of also can be very much a very efficient fiscal agent for us, and I'll get to those in a moment. But I just want to just pause here about and go back to the role of a citizen in living democracy. So it is not just about voting, although that's critical, but it is recognizing that it is our direct experience, it is our common sense, those, especially with young people, the beginner's eyes, I think of it as, you know, like when I was sitting in that library in the 1960s and I said, you know, square one question, why hunger? You know, keep asking those square one questions. That's what the citizen can do. And so I just, and as part of that then, we have to begin to make the effort to see this kind of living democracy emerging, and we see it in stories, such as the stories that I've been hearing since I got here this morning about what you all are doing. But I just want to mention a couple that inspire me. First of all, it doesn't make the evening news or the newspapers, but through our congregations, there are about 3 million Americans engaged in citizen networks in their communities, about 50 cities. One of these networks includes dozens of congregations within 50 different cities in America, working in empowering their congregants to bring their faith to life through very, very, very concrete actions in their communities, and they're working with, of course, others outside of the faith community in terms of unions and others, civic groups, on such core questions of democracy as the right to a living wage. And this is one of the unheralded stories, I think, of the 1990s and this new decade in the 21st century, where now over 100 communities have taken it upon themselves. I mentioned earlier the national level, the minimum wage had less and less purchasing power packed into it, losing its value. So what they did is to say, we're not going to wait for this minimum wage increase that was just passed with the new Congress. We're going to take it upon it. And they organized in their communities for living wage increases and succeeded in over 100 cities. That's the story of living democracy emerging. In San Antonio, one of these organizations of regular people, you know, homemakers and bus drivers and mechanics, they were really upset that in San Antonio, all the good jobs were being given to people who were sort of brought in from the outside, and the local Hispanic people were not being hired. And here's the contrast that I want to draw. Now, when you say, I'm a poor Hispanic person living in San Antonio, I'm watching this happen, the big corporations are all bringing Anglos in from out of town, I have a choice. Do I simply say, okay, there's nothing I can do, I'm a victim of racism and classism, etc., or do I simply blame and protest, or do I say, wait a minute, how do I get curious about why this is going on, and how do I help come up with a solution? And this organization took this third pathway, hundreds of people, well, thousands of people involved, but dozens and dozens of congregations working together. What they did is they got groups of people together to analyze the situation and to sit down with the corporate executives and listen to them. Why aren't you hiring from this community, the poor people right here? And they started studying the they realized that one of the big problems in San Antonio was the job training was not very helpful. It wasn't preparing people for the jobs that were being created by these corporations. And so the corporation said, yeah, we hired local people if they were trained for these jobs. And so instead of just saying, oh, well, we've got a demand that the city does, they sat in their kitchens and studied job training. What works? What doesn't? Why doesn't the local one work? They studied job training as far away as Europe, and they came up with a plan for a job training program that they thought would work, and they then got state and city municipal funds for it. It's called Quest, and if you're curious about it, you can find it online, Quest. It is now not just been replicated in other states, but it is a national model that emerged from what? From actually people who were unemployed or underemployed, and instead of saying, oh, somebody solve it, they had the confidence in their own power to come together, use their common sense, and the power of knowledge that they gained by studying, so that knowledge itself is a form of power, I'm arguing, and they made this happen. And so this is a sample of what I mean by living democracy, and another piece of that, which is getting started in Lawrence, Massachusetts, and maybe other Massachusetts towns, but is now in 300 cities in Brazil, and I just visited one in Brazil, but also in France. I visited this going on. It's called Participatory Budgeting. And what the participatory budgeting means is that, again, you know, the poorest people in communities feeling like, wait a minute, taxes are collected, there's a budget set, nobody ever really looks at it, and a lot of the benefits, the new roads and the improvements are all going to benefit the people who need it the least. And so they demanded an eyes on the process, a voice in the process. And so in Brazil, which is now catching on, starting in Lawrence, as I mentioned, they actually bring people into assemblies where they debate face to face how the money is to be spent. And you know, one of the consequences of this is that not only is the money going to where it's needed the most, but it's much more efficient. They estimate in Brazil that for every dollar now of public resources on key services like roads or schools, that sort of thing, instead of for one administrative dollar, $4 of actual output in the community, it's $1 administrative for, I think, 7, something like that. It's an enormous benefit, also in efficiency of how it works. So we then begin to rethink a living democracy. It's not something done to me or for me. It is my own power and my own creativity. And I just want to tell you one story that is in Hope's Edge that I love, because it kind of captures, my daughter and I were there together in this 4th largest city in Brazil that looks like any American city and certainly has extreme differences of wealth and poverty. And we were drawn to this city because right before we left on this world trip when we rode Hope's Edge, we had heard that this city had declared food a right. Good food a right. Not just junk food, not just, you know, any food. Good, as much as possible, organic food, they declared it is a right of citizenship. And what they said, look, this means that if you are poor, you're still a citizen. And therefore, I, as a city official, I am still accountable to you. And I'm accountable to make the market work for you. And so what the government's role, and this is my sort of my little object lesson, I mean, it's sort of how do I think of the role of government in a living democracy. So the government played the role of convener, first of all. So the local government had a food security agency headed by a woman named Adriana. And Adriana then got the farmers, the big institutions, got the religious community, the business community, the university, all together, and were brainstorming and planning what are the innovations that we could come up with that would really get to the root of hunger and make food a right in Belo Horizonte. That's the name of the city. It means a beautiful horizon. So they tapped the creativity of all these different, very diverse people. And they came up with literally dozens of ideas. Some of them really could happen here in Worcester. For example, maybe they are, we can find out in a minute, but they made available to the small local farmer, small plots of land that the city owned but wasn't using. You know, maybe there was a building project and they had a few yards of land left that the city owned and there was nothing really happening on it. And they said, okay, you small farmer can use this land, but here is the standard setting role. They said, the government said, you can use the land to sell your produce, to bring it into to the poorest people, but you've got to keep it within the price range of the poorest people in the barrio. And on weekends, you've got to take it out into the outlying poor areas where people don't have access to local fresh produce. And it was a win-win because the local farmers had this great market, and they didn't have a middleman in between, so they made much more profit. So they were thrilled. They did things like they took the school lunch amount of money that the federal government in Brazil gave them for school lunch, and they, instead of buying corporate processed food with it, they bought local organic food with it. They put in the bus stops, they put signs. This is the university teamed up with them, and they put every week signs of what stores have the cheapest of 45 basic commodities that every family would need. And so that put the downward pressure, so there couldn't be the price gouging, because as we know, it is the poorest communities in this country that pay the highest prices. So this put downward pressure on that. With shifting the frame, this is all about how do we shift the filter, shift the frame through which we see reality. They said, oh, we've been throwing out eggshells, and we've been throwing out manioc leaves. This is a widely eaten plant. But actually, they're very nutritious. So they ground them. They created a process of grinding them and then adding them to the rolls in all of the children's nurseries and schools. And so these, in their school gardens and community gardens and on and on and on and on. And this cost, okay, let me tell you the punchline here. Within 10 years, they reduced infant death rate in their city. Infant death rate is the best measure of hunger. They reduced infant death rate in 10 years by 56%. And it cost 1% of the city budget. 1% of city budget. This is a large, large city. So thousands of babies lived who would have died without this initiative. And so at the end of our stay there in Brazil, we're sitting down with Adriana Ranja. And, literally our mouths were just dropping open at the creativity and the courage. And I said, Adriana, did you realize how out of step you were when you started all this? Because, the rest of the world is saying, oh, no, the government can do no good and the market can do no bad, and you just have to turn everything over to whatever the market says. And you're actually saying that government and market forces and citizens can all work together to actually make it possible for everyone to eat healthy food? And I was just shaking my head. Do you realize how out of step you are? So then Adriana starts going off in Portuguese. And I don't understand a word of Portuguese. Fortunately, there's an interpreter sitting next to me. And she goes on and on, very agitated, and then her eyes start to well up with tears. And she says, I don't know what she says, but I know she's crying, and so I nudge the interpreter. I said, okay, you've got to interrupt her now, because I have to know what's making her cry. And she said this. When she started to tear up, she had just said, yes, I knew how out of step that we were when we started this Right to Food initiative. And I knew how much hunger there was in the world. But what I did not know, and what upsets me so, is how easy it is to end it. And obviously, I will never forget those words, because what I took that to mean, actually, and I think that I'm interpreting this correctly, and by the way, you can go on our website, smallplanetinstitute.org, and see a slideshow from Adriana that we just got a few months ago that updates all of this to the national level. But what I got from that is that if we are willing to shift the frame, if we are willing to rethink what is the role of citizen as problem solver, not as victim or problem, but as problem solver, and government, not as the intrusive do for us, but the convener and the standard setter, then it does become easy. And not only that, it's invigorating. And so that story really, really does stay with me for the rest of my life. So I'd like to conclude on a much more personal level, however, a much more personal level, because I can say these words, I can say these words about how we have to change our ideas and say, oh no, hunger is not caused by lack of food, it's It's not just caused by poverty, because that's still a symptom. It is really caused by a thought system that disempowers us, that creates these human relationships that are so out of balance. I can say that. How do we act on it? What is required of us much more personally? And this is what I'm coming to at this point in my life, is that I think that two things are required. They still have to do with our ideas, because I am a person who believes that it's our ideas who create who we are. But one of them is rethinking the idea of what is power itself. Mm-hmm. Because we absorb the idea of, oh, power. Power is in money, power is in guns, power is in official office. And I'm saying that the kind of power that each person in this room has, and in the stories that I just mentioned, they didn't really have much of any of those things that we associate with power. What they did have, they did the research, they had the knowledge, like these folks in San Antonio, their knowledge power. They had the power of numbers, just because they were able to bring people together who wanted to make a difference. They had the power of their own creativity. They had the power of their persistence, that just keeping at it. And so I began to see that the first step is rethinking power as something inside of us, and that we can access, certainly in community. But additionally, to even get that far, we have to rethink something else. And this really gets personal. That we grow up in this society, in virtually every society, thinking that fear and the sensations of discomfort in the body, in my case, it's that pounding heart, it's the dry throat, the cold sweat, when I feel insecure. And we evolved in very tightly knit communities. 95% of our time was in these hunter-gathering societies where we knew that our survival really depended on hanging together in very close-knit community. But now that, in a sense, I think of it as kind of our hyper-tribe is heading to disaster, right over the falls, then separating from the group might be exactly what we need to do. And it might mean life instead of death at this moment. And yet, separating, being different, getting the new idea, thinking differently, starting something new that might not work, all of that we might lose face with the pack, with the tribe, is still scary. And so a lot of what I think about these days is that really the future of our communities, whether it's Worcester, whether it's Massachusetts, or the larger world, is how we human beings come to think about and experience fear. Because if we really believe that those fear sensations, when they happen, if we really take that to mean a verdict that we're on the wrong path, we're in the wrong place, wrong time. I mean, yes, we should get out of the way of moving trucks. I'm not saying that. A lot of times when we get in, speak up and have a new idea, or break, as you are, all of you in this room are doing, it can be. I met a young woman who was a Teach for America teacher last night in St. Louis, working in a very, very poor school district in St. Louis, and she said she cried all night before her first day. She was so scared that she would be a failure. But she did it. She did it. And she was just glowing when she was talking about her 80 kids. And I looked at her, you have 80 kids? That it might be that those sensations of fear in us are telling us that we are exactly where we need to be, doing exactly what that our truer selves call on. And so what I'm suggesting then is that I feel that each of you, from what I've been able to learn and been so impressed by, that really I would just like to leave you with this thought that the greatest power that you have is who you are. Because more and more neuroscience is learning that we model ourselves on each other moment to moment. Every time one of your classmates is observing what you are doing, they are changed by it, even if they don't show it. That we become, in a sense, what we observe. There's these mirror neurons. So when I'm going like this with my hand, there are actually neurons in your brain firing as if you were doing this. Yes. So in that sense, our greatest power is who we are. Are we risk takers? Because people are modeling themselves after us moment to moment. So I'm also saying then that means that whatever you're doing, take at least 10% of the time to tell other people about it. And don't be shy. Tell your story. Because how do we shed this deadly belief system that makes us powerless? It is through story. Story of possibility. Story of pushing hope's edge, as Anna and I call it. And so once we then realize that our greatest power is who we are, and that it is so much simply a question that we've been trapped in thoughts that tell us we're powerless, then we come to see, and this is the greatest thing about getting old. I mean, there are many great things about getting old, but one of them is that I can look back and realize that not one of the things that most inspires me today would I have given much of a chance at all for success when I was your age. And that is really humbling. And you know what it tells me is my little motto has become, it's not possible to know what's possible. If you take that to heart, it's not possible to know what's possible, you are a free human being. Because it means you can just go for it. Go for what your common sense. And now, of course, you know, again, the neuroscience is confirming that we aren't just these little shabby, selfish critters fighting each other in the mall, that actually hardwired, we have a deep need for fairness. We enjoy cooperation. In fact, we experience cooperation in the same parts of the brain that light up when we eat chocolate. That's how much fun it is to cooperate in the kind of teams you're building, and we all know that. So, and of course we do deeply, deeply need to feel powerful as a deep human need, and to have meaning and purpose in our lives. So as we manifest these more rich and complex dimensions of ourselves, that is truly the power that we have. And you never know who's watching. You never know whose life you affect simply by your courage to act from the sense of possibility. So I will just end with these words from 1921 from a Chinese writer. It's not even a poem, but it sounds like a poem to me. I've been hanging on my wall since the 1970s. Hope cannot be said to exist, nor can it be said not to exist. For hope is just like the roads across the earth. In the beginning, there were no roads, but when many people pass one way, a road is made. Thank you.